components. For many of you, you learned about SSDE earlier today in CT. Olav is now the leader of our CDOS, or Clinical Dose Optimization Service within Landauer, and he works with nearly 100 hospitals across the country and many systems that have standardized on our service to develop effective dose and optimization processes. So without further ado, I want to introduce Olav and welcome him to the stage. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you for coming tonight. It's my pleasure to be here talking to you. And the title of the talk is A Dose of Reality about Clinical Dose Optimization, Views from the Field. And the point of today's session is really to allow our expert panel members, who all have experience in setting up dose optimization programs, to share their knowledge and experience with you, answer some of the common questions that everybody is dealing with. But before we move into that, I want to give a short presentation where I give you some background, where I talk about some of the new requirements and tools to help you meet those requirements. First, a few disclosures. I work for Landauer Medical Physics. Landauer has partnered with several commercial dose monitoring programs, including being a reseller for Radiometrics. Additionally, Landauer provides a broad range of medical physics programs, including a clinical dose optimization service. So where I'd like to start is something that is commonly overlooked when doing these sort of presentations, and that's the benefits of doing a CT scan. Now, I'm going to focus primarily on CT for my presentation today. If you have questions about dose optimization for other modalities, please feel free. Please be encouraged to ask those during the Q&A session. I just want to put out I'm going to focus on CT. So why do we use CT? Well, it's fast, gives a very fast diagnosis. It gives an accurate diagnosis, oftentimes more accurate than you can get from the other modalities. As a result, we've had reduced exploratory surgery. You can monitor treatment progress, reduced length of hospitalizations, and the big one is the last one at the end, decreased mortality. Put simply, CT scans save lives, millions of lives every year. As a result, the number of CT scans we've been doing has been rising fairly consistently since they were introduced. And now, the most recent estimate I've heard is that over 80 million CT scans are done in the US alone every year. With this rise in CT utilization, there's also an increase in the radiation exposure to the US population. In the early 1980s, the vast majority of the exposure to the US population was from background radiation, cosmic rays, and radon gas. That hasn't changed much. That component of the background exposure hasn't changed much. But what has changed is the exposure to the US population from medical imaging. And it's grown to almost 50% of the exposure to the US population. And primarily that's due to increase in CT. The reason this is a concern is that radiation has been linked to causing cancer. And what I'm showing you here is the risk of inducing cancer relative to the exposure to the person. And the straight line there is known as the linear no threshold theory. This is based on our current knowledge. This is the best model that we have for what the risks from a CT scan or from exposure to radiation are. And according to this model, the more radiation dose you get, the higher your risk of cancer. Therefore, we would want to keep the radiation dose as low as diagnostically achievable. I say diagnostically achievable because, coming back to my first point I started with, the important thing to remember is that CT scans save lives. We need to ensure that diagnostic quality first. Beyond the stochastic risks of cancer induction, there are deterministic effects as well. And I'm sure you probably saw images like this that made it into the media. Some of those deterministic effects include hair loss, skin reddening, cataract induction, among others. And the thing that was really concerning when these articles came out a few years ago was not that there were a few isolated cases where the exposure was high enough to cause these effects, but rather that these effects went unnoticed for a year or more because there was no program in place to detect them and correct them. And even once people started to say, we need to do something about this, we need to have some sort of quality assurance program in place, there's no hard standards for how much radiation dose is too much. There's been a lot of response to this, changes in state regulations, recommendations from professional societies, renewed interest in reducing radiation dose. But what I want to focus on today is the changes in the Joint Commission requirements. Specifically, there's 4 requirements, and I've listed them there. I'll go through each one of them. The first requirement is a requirement to document the radiation dose index. That's either the CTDI, DLP, or SSDE, size-specific dose estimate, for every CT examination. This must be exam-specific, summarized by series or anatomic region, and be in a retrievable format. One note is that this standard only applies to scanners capable of producing the radiation dose index. I'll come back to that with a later requirement. The second requirement is that you establish CT protocols based on current standards of practice, and those protocols are to include clinical indication, contrast administration, age, pediatric versus adult, patient size and body habitus, and the expected dose index range. Now that's one of the ones that's making people scratch their heads and saying, well, how do I set the expected dose index range? We'll give you some more information on that later as well. The third one is that CT protocols are reviewed with input from an interpreting radiologist, a medical physicist, and a lead imaging technologist. And this review is to ensure that protocols adhere to current standards of practice and changes in CT equipment. The hospital is allowed to determine the frequency of these reviews. And the fourth requirement is that the hospital reviews incidents where the radiation dose index exceeded expected dose index ranges. Now you notice I have the word all in brackets there. I'll come back to that in just 1 second. As part of this review, you're supposed to compare the incidents to external benchmarks. So what is that, the word all in there? Why is that in brackets? Well, that's not part of the requirement. But at the AAPM spring clinical meeting, we had an opportunity to talk with some representatives from the Joint Commission at one of the sessions there, and I asked them a question. I asked whether we could review a sample of the cases that exceed the expected dose index range. And their answer was that the intent of the Joint Commission is that you review all cases that exceed the expected dose index range. So that's one of the things I wanted to make sure that everyone is aware of, is that changes the approach to how you're going to manage this. It makes it much more difficult to do without having the appropriate tools in place. One other thing I want to comment on here is this requirement does not say that it only applies to scanners capable of producing the radiation dose index. This applies to all CT scanners. So Bob Pizzatello, who's in the audience here, gave a talk earlier today where he discussed some techniques for managing that. And if any of you have an interest about that, I encourage you to ask about that during the question and answer session. These requirements are not easy to meet. What I'm showing you here is a survey that was published in an Aunt Minnie article just a couple weeks ago. And this survey was not conducted by the Joint Commission, but it was looking at one group's interpretation of the Joint Commission requirements and how many sites would be in compliance with those requirements. The thing I want to highlight for you is these 3 right here. Documentation of the radiation dose index for every scan. 29% of those surveyed would have been in compliance. Adoption of protocols based on current standards of practice. They're only 39%. And periodic review of protocols, 50%. So this indicates that there are a lot of people out there that have not yet determined how they're going to meet these requirements, even though they've gone into effect earlier this month. So how can you meet these requirements? Well, there's a number of freely available resources. There's the AAPM Practice Guideline 1A on CT protocol management and review. There's AAPM CT protocols that are published on the AAPM website. This is a great resource, goes through all the different vendors and has recommendations for major imaging protocols. Then there's, of course, the Image Wisely and Image Gently websites with tons of resources there as well. I encourage you to look at all of those resources. On top of that, there's also the American College of Radiology Dose Index Registry. You're probably all familiar with this. Essentially, it allows you to submit your radiation dose indices to a database with others from across the nation, and you can then compare your results versus the rest of the nation, as well as other people in your region or similar institutions. On top of that, there's the commercial radiation exposure monitoring software packages, and I've listed all the ones I'm aware of. I tried to give you an exhaustive list. I'm sure there are some that I've missed, but there are a number of choices out there. And then there's also the NEMA XR29 requirement of dose check. Dose check is a software package that can be installed on CT scanners that before the scan can notify you or alert you if the CTDI is or DLP is predicted to go above thresholds that you set. And the way it works is there's really two levels. There's a notification level, which is protocol specific and at the series level. And then there's an alert level, which is a global value across all the protocols, and it's at the examination level. And that alert level, the FDA recommended value is 1,000 milligray. The notification level, there aren't any real firm recommendations about that, but the AAPM has come out with recommended notification levels, and that's also available on the AAPM's website. To help our clients, we put together a program we call the Clinical Dose Optimization Service, or CDOS. And it consists of many components. I'm going to highlight a few of them for you today. First is recommendations for practical expected dose index ranges. The second is monitoring of cases that exceed those expected dose index ranges. What are you going to do once one of those comes in? How do you look at them? What benchmarks are you comparing them to? Third is guidance on configuring dose monitoring software. Issues like protocol mapping, setting dose alert levels, creating dashboards, generating reports, things like that. Fourth one is a protocol review and recommendations for optimization. In my opinion, it's not enough to glance at the protocols and check the box and say, yeah, I reviewed them. You need to look at them in detail. You need to say, okay, here's a protocol where we can make an improvement, and here's how you can do it. You need to change this scan parameter. And fifth is a review of policies and procedures for compliance with state regulations and national standards. And I want to share with you some of the experiences we've had with this program with our clients. This is, by the way, this figure was generated using the Radiometric software. This is not meant to favor any one dose monitoring vendor over another. This just happens to be the product that the hospital I was pulling this data from was using. What you're seeing on this plot, I know the numbers are kind of small, so I'll walk you through it. On the y-axis, you're seeing the CTDI. Over here, this is the CTDI. And on the x-axis is the patient size. And each point on this plot is an individual examination. And generally what you see is as the size increases, the CTDI goes up. And that's what you would expect. You need a more radiation dose as patients get larger. There's a few things that stand, let me back up. The different colors are two different CT scanners. There's a few things that stand out. The first one is you have this plateau here. This is something I see very commonly at almost all of our sites. That's when you run into tube current limitations. The tube cannot put out more MA. And as a result, those patients are receiving the same dose, even though it should be higher, and the noise is going up. So that's the first thing I would comment on, and that's why we use the word dose optimization rather than dose reduction. It's about getting the right dose to get the image quality you need. But the thing I really wanted to highlight today is these points here that follow a completely different trend than all the others. And what's going on there is these were all the same protocol, but this was an outdated protocol that was still in the scanner that was being used. It was from several years ago. The protocol had been changed, the dose was reduced, and they did not know this was still in clinical use. The next example I want to give you is the same plot. So we have got CTDI on the y-axis, patient size on the x-axis. And this time the two different colors, instead of being two different CT scanners, are referring to two different protocols. The white is the normal protocol, and the green dots are the large protocol. It's not surprising that the large protocol has a higher CTDI than the normal protocol, But what is surprising is if you look at a given patient size, patients might be imaged with either the large or the normal protocol. So the technologists are making a judgment call. And depending on what their choice is, the dose is considerably different. In this group, the CTDI is 18 milligray, and for the large protocol, the CTDI is 43 milligray, more than a factor of 2 difference in dose. And this is why I say it's not enough just to look at the protocols. You need to look through the data with a fine-tooth comb. You need to find out where are the places where we can make a difference. These 2 protocols should give a much more similar dose. This one is showing the number of alerts by technologist. So the technologists are down here. I've removed their names. And the green bar is indicating the number of exams that they did that were below the threshold that was set. And the red is indicating exams above the threshold. And what stands out here is one technologist is responsible for virtually all the alerts for this protocol. And what's happening in this case was this technologist was following a different procedure for large patients than the other technologists. And another example, this is looking at the pediatric head protocol across a health system. The different colors here are for different scanner manufacturers. I'm going to keep that anonymized for now. But the thing I wanted to point your attention to is what's going on here, here, and here. What's happening is these sites are using the adult head protocol on pediatric patients. These are easy things to correct once identified. You look and say, use the pediatric protocol. Change your noise index on your large protocol. Stop using protocols that are out of date. But you need to find the data first. I wanted to give you a few examples of once you've identified these problems, how much impact that you can have. This is a protocol looking at 3 scanners at one of the sites I've worked with. And they were looking at, this is pulmonary embolism protocol. And the green bar here is the ACR dose index registry, 25th to 75th percentile. So in an ideal world, you'd be somewhere in that green bar. What they found out is the median dose for 2 of their scanners was above that 75th percentile. And they said, why is that? When we took a look at the protocols, found out that the slice thickness was set incorrectly. We corrected that problem, and afterwards, the doses came back in line, and the radiologists were pleased with the images. And the last example I want to share with you is, again, the same plot I've been showing you, CTDI on the y-axis, patient size on the x-axis. And as patient size goes up, the CTDI goes up. This is what we've seen in the past. You see that same plateau. But what I want to highlight is these points over here and down here, where the CTDI is considerably above what it should be for a patient of that size. And in this case, what I did is I trained the technologist. I looked into what was causing that, trained the technologist on what was causing those problems, and also put the expected dose range in the protocol and trained the technologist to look at that expected dose range before scanning the patient. And afterwards, those points virtually disappeared. So that was just to give you a sense of what you can accomplish when you have an effective dose optimization process. There's a number of questions people have about how to establish an effective process, such as what's the right tool for my hospital? What's the cost? How much time do I need? Who needs to be involved? What is the process? And how can I determine appropriate benchmarks? I'm not going to try to answer all those questions today because that's why we brought our panel members. So at this point, I want to open it up to the question and answer session.
Hopefully you've written down a few questions that you might want to ask of our panel. Before we go to our Q&A, I am going to just bring up our panel and allow them to introduce themselves. We're really